Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Tran Mendez, and I am an academic trainer here with the Center for Teaching and Learning. And today's session is called The Journey to Mars, and our presenter is Dr. Kirby Reutter. And he is a graduate of NCU, and he is also the Academic Poster of the Year winner from 2018. So I'm very excited to have him here with us today. Before we get started, I just have a couple of housekeeping items. I am currently recording this session, and I will post it in the comments in the webinar section of the CTL site. So you'll have access to not only the recording, but you'll also have access to Dr. Reutter's slides. And throughout our session here today, if you have any questions, please type them into the chat box, and Dr. Reutter will be able to address them throughout his presentation. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to him.
Good morning, Tran. How are you?
I'm great.
Very good. Would you like me to just jump in right into the training and get started?
Yep, let's get started.
Okay. I will do that. Okay, so I sometimes have a tendency to over-prepare when I do trainings of this nature. So I am going to be speaking pretty quickly just to make sure we cover all the material. Like Tran mentioned, if you do have any questions throughout the training, feel free to send them to me via chat. And I will do my best to weave in my responses as we go along. But if I don't get to them, that's fine. I love to network, so I'd be happy to follow up with you after the fact, after we're done with the training. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm calling this training The Journey from Mars, and we're going to be talking about how trauma affects brain development. So if you follow along with me in the slides, the second slide you'll see is all of my contact information. So like I mentioned, I love to network. So by all means, please follow up with me after the training if you have any further questions. So I would like to start off mentioning 5 brief themes of brain development. And before I do that, I want to just mention a quick case study because I think this kind of information will make more sense if we have an actual person in mind. So the case study I want to use is a young lady named Sofia. So she was a former client of mine. Her mother was a prostitute in Mexico. Her father was from the state of Indiana. This young lady was coerced into adoption by her father at age 10. And her father then proceeded to raise this young lady as a prostitute. Not only that, but the father was also the member of a gang that facilitated the trafficking of his daughter. So in addition to being raised as a prostitute in her own house, she was also being trafficked. So sometimes she was forced to live for days at a time in a storage shed where adult men had basically had unlimited access to her. And just to show how much her dad valued her, sometimes her services were exchanged for motorcycle parts. So after years of daily chronic sexual abuse, she was finally impregnated by her father at the age of 13. And the same father then proceeded to violently abort the baby himself. So not surprisingly, all of these things that happened to Sofia in her childhood affected the way in which her brain developed. So that's what we're going to be talking about. So if you look at this first slide, there's 5 basic themes that I want to address really quickly. The first basic theme of brain development is that the brain develops in a very specific order. So the first part of the brain to develop is what we call the survival brain. So the survival brain drives everything we do automatically, such as circulation or digestion or respiration, including our instinctive response to danger or crisis. And as most of us probably already know, we have 3 instinctive reactions to danger or crisis, and that is fight, flight, and freeze. Now, in the case of healthy child development, so in other words, if we're talking about a child that is not constantly exposed to danger or crisis, their survival brain develops at a normal pace and is relatively contained. In addition, someone that's growing up in a safe environment, they have supportive caregivers that are helping this child co-regulate their survival brain when it does get triggered. Okay, but as you can imagine, that's not what happened with Sofia. Her survival brain was constantly getting triggered. In fact, the people that should have been protecting her were actually the ones that were obviously triggering that survival brain even more. So in her case, her survival brain overdeveloped, and especially that fight, flight, freeze response. And as we're going to see, this is going to have a ripple effect on the rest of her brain development. So the next part of the brain to develop in childhood is the emotion brain. So this is the part of the brain that interprets signals from the survival brain and then communicates with the rest of the brain. So in the case of a healthy childhood, if you remember, that survival brain is relatively stable, it's relatively contained. Even when it's triggered, it's still co-regulated by a healthy caregiver. So when that's the case, the emotion brain has the luxury to fully develop as it's supposed to. So in other words, a full spectrum of both positive and negative emotions, all of which that child will need later on in life. But once again, that's not what happened in the case of Sofia. Since her survival brain was overdeveloped, that's going to affect her emotion brain. It's going to affect her emotion brain in a couple of different ways. One way that it affected her emotion brain is that positive emotions did not develop. Because if you think about it, you don't really need positive emotions in order to execute fight, flight, freeze. Not only that, but Sofia even learned that positive emotions were bad or maybe even dangerous. For example, if I love daddy, but then daddy treats me in these horrific ways, then, well, maybe it's not such a good idea to love someone. So that's one way her emotion brain was affected. But her emotion brain was also affected in another way. So just like positive emotions underdeveloped, well, her negative emotions overdeveloped. So why is that? Well, you do need negative emotions in order to execute fight, flight, and freeze. So what's typical in traumatized children is that there are two negative emotions in particular that tend to overdevelop, and they are fear and anger. And once again, this is going to have a ripple effect on the rest of brain development, because the next part of the brain to develop is the attachment brain. So once again, going back to a healthy childhood, we have this co-regulated, stable survival brain. We have a full spectrum of both positive and negative emotions. Well, those are precisely the tools you need to develop healthy attachments with other people, right? To be able to bond with other people, connect with other people, relate to other people. But once again, that is not how Sofia's brain developed. Since she had constantly activated fight, flight, and freeze with lots of fear and anger from the emotion brain, she simply did not have the tools she needed to develop and foster healthy attachments. So not surprisingly, what we tend to see in traumatized children is that the attachment brain is underdeveloped. And then the last and final part of the brain to develop is the cognition brain. So this is the part of the brain that, based on all previous life experiences, forms views of the self and others and the world at large. This is also the part of the brain that makes decisions, such as cause and effect, pros and cons, short-term versus long-term. These are all things that factor into the cognition brain. So once again, if you have a well-contained, co-regulated survival brain, if you have all of the emotions at your disposal, if you have solid attachments, you will develop a healthy cognition brain as well, right? You'll have, at the very least, you'll have a balanced view of the self, the world, and others in conjunction with balanced decision-making, right? Decision-making that factors in both short-term and long-term consequences. But once again, that is not how Sofia's brain developed. So based on her previous life experiences, obviously she had a very negative view of self, others, in the world. And she also developed a highly impulsive decision-making style. Because someone that's been chronically traumatized, they simply don't have the luxury to sit around and plan a future, right? In Sofia's case, her future could have ended that day. So that explains why she did not develop functions such as cause and effect, pros and cons, short-term and long-term. Okay, so the first point is that the brain develops in this specific order. But the second point I want to make here is that the brain also develops really super fast in those first few years of life. So, one metric that represents that fact is that a child's brain is 90% the adult size by age 4. So that doesn't mean that the child's brain is literally 90% capacity, but nonetheless, that's a pretty strong indicator that a child's brain is growing really, really fast in those early years. And if you think about it, that's highly adaptive. One example of why it's adaptive for your brain to grow so fast that early on in life is just think of language. Language is probably by far the most complex thing we do as humans. To this day, linguists, neurologists, psychologists cannot fully explain the phenomenon of language. We have no clue how a child can learn something so complex so automatically when their brain isn't even developed yet, right? It's absolutely amazing. But if you think about it, that also explains just how quickly and permanently a child is soaking up trauma if that's part of their environment. So keep that in mind as we go through this. Okay, so another basic theme of brain development is that our brain is actually just like any other muscle in that it follows the use it or lose it principle. So if part of the brain is overworked, it overdevelops. If it's underworked, it underdevelops. And that's exactly what we've seen so far. So for example, with that survival brain, it's overworked, so it overdevelops, right? Positive emotions, underutilized, underdeveloped. Negative emotions, overused, overdeveloped. Attachment brain, underused, underdeveloped. In fact, someone that's been traumatized, far from seeing attachments as a source of security, will probably see attachments as a source of danger. So not surprisingly, attachment brain becomes underdeveloped. And then same with the cognition brain. Decision-making becomes underdeveloped. Okay, so the tragedy of a traumatized brain really doesn't even end there, because as we can see from point number 4, not only does the brain develop in a very specific order, but the brain also processes all incoming information in that same exact order, right? So that's why we can't tell someone that's been traumatized, well, that happened to you 10 years ago or 50 years ago, just get over it. No, because once a brain is wired in a certain way because of years and years of accumulated trauma, the brain continues to process all incoming information through those same exact channels. So in a little bit, we'll talk about more examples of this. Just in case you're struggling to believe this idea that the brain processes information in the same exact order as it's developed. Let's assume it's 2 a.m. and you hear a loud sound and you're startled. So that event that just happened, it first enters your senses and then goes straight to the back of your brain, the survival part of the brain. That's exactly why your first reaction is to startle. So the next thing that will happen to you is that you'll probably feel some kind of fear. And then the next thing that will happen to you is your mind will probably start to go to, is everyone safe? And then from there, your mind might go to, oh yeah, that was just the dog. I forgot to let him out or whatever. Okay, so in the case of a non-traumatized brain, that information, it still goes through survival brain, emotion brain, attachment brain, and cognition brain. But it jumps to those hoops really quickly, unless we're triggered by something. But in the case of a traumatized brain, that's not the case. That information is actually getting stuck in all those hoops, as we'll talk about in a little bit. So based on these first 4 themes, this all kind of seems like doom and gloom. Like what kind of hope do we have? So the fifth theme here is actually our silver lining. So the fifth theme here basically says that the brain is not set in stone, right? So you've probably heard of terms like plasticity or malleability. My own personally favorite term to describe this phenomenon is post-traumatic growth. In other words, the brain can continue to learn and grow and make new connections at the synapses throughout life, right? We can learn new experiences to supplement the experiences we've already had. But here's the deal. Let's go back to our language analogy. Remember, we learn language really quickly and permanently at a young age. But so for those of you that have tried to learn another language as an adult, as I have, you know that is extremely difficult. And that's exactly what it's like for someone that's been traumatized to learn new skills, right? Learn the skills that they need to basically reprogram their brain. When you learn a new language, that's what you, as an adult, that's what you're doing. You're reprogramming your brain, and that is very difficult work. So if you've even had a little bit of that experience, maybe in high school, say high school Spanish, then you can relate to how difficult it is for someone that has experienced chronic trauma to then learn new ways of dealing with life. Okay, so just in case you're having trouble believing this whole idea of these four parts of the brain really does have these four systems, right? We have this fight or flight system, which is mostly characterized by adrenaline. We have this reward system, which is mostly characterized by dopamine. This friend intent system, which is mostly characterized by oxytocin. And then finally, we have this cognitive control system. And what we know about these four systems is that it is difficult to access the cognitive control system when the other three systems are triggered, right? So just think of how that applies to someone that's been chronically traumatized. So in other words, the goal of trauma treatment is we have to find a way to basically help those first three systems relax so that the person can then resume control of their life via the cognitive control system. So this next slide is a summary of what we've been talking about so far. So for someone that has been chronically traumatized as a child, this is literally how their brain develops. Fight, flight, and freeze is overdeveloped, which in turn causes positive emotions to underdevelop, while negative emotions overdevelop, which in turn causes attachments to underdevelop, while negative beliefs overdevelop, and decision-making underdevelops. But like I mentioned before, this does not just apply to brain development. This also applies to how the brain processes all incoming information in the present, right? So once the brain has already been skewed in all of these ways, all incoming information also filters through these same peaks and valleys. So let's just take as an example, let's assume someone that's been chronically traumatized is presented with neutral, or let's even say positive information. What do you think happens to that information by the time it filters through fight, flight, and freeze, followed by negative emotions, followed by negative beliefs? So is that information still so neutral or positive anymore? No, it's not. That information is now going to be severely skewed or distorted. And that's one of the reasons that people that have been traumatized are so easily triggered by things that wouldn't be considered a trigger to the rest of us. Okay, and if you're still having trouble believing this brain stuff, let's take a look at a scan of two different brains. So on the left of your screen, you should see a healthy brain. On the right, you should see an abused brain. And if you look at those two brains, you can notice some differences. So in this brain scan, red indicates increased neurological activity. So if you look at the back of the abused brain, what do you see? So that's the survival part of the brain. Do you see how there's more red than the healthy brain, right? Because that part of the brain is overdeveloped. Now let's move to the front part of the brain. Do you see how, in this case, there's more red in the healthy brain versus the abused brain, right? That's the cognitive part of the brain, the part that does decision-making and forms views of self, others, and the world. And if you notice all the black in the abused brain, black indicates almost no neurological activity at all. So what do you notice there? So do you see how there's all of that black in the abused brain that's not in the healthy brain? So that's the part of the brain that's supposed to be regulating emotions. Okay, so how do we take all of this information and start to apply it in a practical sense? So if you take a look at this chart, this is a model I've developed myself to provide me a framework to know what to do when I'm working with someone that's traumatized. So what I've done is I've laid out those four systems we've been talking about, right? The survival brain, the emotion brain, the attachment brain, and the cognition brain. And to follow up on a point I already made, really all of these things have to be stable if the client can enter what I call the balanced brain. And you're probably also wondering why I have those planets up there. So let me explain that. This is an analogy that I developed when my son was in kindergarten. He wanted to be an astronaut. He's 13 now and he still wants to be an astronaut. But I remember reading this book on the solar system with him, and I actually still have it. In fact, I have it right here. I'm going to reference it. And what I noticed is each of these planets that directly follow planet Earth also directly parallel what's going on in these different brain systems. So, for example, planet Mars has lots of volcanic activity. So I'm just going to read directly from this book. Mars also has very large volcanoes. For example, the volcano Olympus Mons is 3 times taller than Mount Everest on Earth. Mars is also known for its thin atmosphere. Okay, so think of our traumatized clients when they are in survival brain mode. So think of fight, flight, freeze. Will there be some volcanic activity? Yes, there will. Will there be a thin atmosphere? Yes, there will. So keep that in mind. When our clients are in survival brain mode, they're on Mars. The next planet out after Mars is Jupiter. And Jupiter is actually known for its very stormy conditions. So for example, Jupiter has a huge storm that swirls like a hurricane. The storm itself is twice the size of Earth. Astronomers have named it the Great Red Spot. Okay, and to this day, nobody knows where that Great Red Spot came from or why it doesn't go away. It's just this huge, massive hurricane that just keeps going on and on and on. Okay, so even when our clients that have been traumatized, even when their survival brain has settled down, chances are there are still going to be some stormy conditions with their emotions. So that's Jupiter. Okay, the next planet out is Saturn. So as we know, Saturn is known for its rings. So think of attachments. So Saturn is the 6th planet from the sun. It has thousands of narrow rings circling it. But what are these rings made of? Are these diamond rings? No, obviously not. These rings are made of rocks and ice. So just realize when we're working with a traumatized client, when they're in attachment brain mode, sometimes conditions will be a little bit rocky and icy, right? It just goes with the turf. It's part of being on Saturn. We should recognize that. Okay, well, the next planet out is Uranus. So what do we know about Uranus? Uranus is the only planet that has a sideways rotation. So think of, once again, of our traumatized clients. Even when the other 3 systems of their brain are settled, calm, relaxed, they still have what we call thinking errors, right? Their thinking is still highly skewed, right? They just have a different rotation than some of the rest of us. Okay, and then once again, let's assume that we've done lots of work with the survival brain, emotion brain, attachment brain, and cognition brain. And we've helped the client get to a point of what I call the balanced brain, which can be represented by Neptune. So what do we know about Neptune? Well, according to my son's book from kindergarten, Neptune is the 8th planet from the sun. And what we know about Neptune is they still has storms, but they're not as bad as Jupiter's. Okay, so even when we've made lots of progress with our clients, right, if we can get them all the way to Neptune, there's still going to be some storms, but that's okay, right? Once again, it goes with the territory. Okay, so how do we apply all of this in a practical sense? Well, if we're working with someone that's traumatized and they're currently in crisis mode, we need to figure out what brain they're in. And then we know how to proceed from there. So for example, if we have a client that is currently actively triggered, and they're in absolute crisis mode, they're on Mars, right? If they're actively using fight, flight, and freeze, that's the survival brain. So if that's the case, if they're on Mars and they're acting like a Martian, would it make any sense to start working on their thinking, their thought patterns? No, it would not, because you would be 3 planets away, right? If they're on Mars and you start to, correct their thinking, you are basically talking from Uranus, right? And they will tell you that. So instead, what you need to do is meet them where they're at on Mars and provide treatment interventions. And then from there, help them get to Jupiter and provide treatment interventions. And then from there, help them get to Saturn and so forth. Because remember, the brain develops in a very specific order, but the brain also processes information in a very specific order. So if we're going to be successful in providing treatments, we need to figure out what part of the brain they're in and then guide them along all the way to their Neptune. So if you notice, what I also have on this chart are the specific treatment interventions that will help clients progress through the different planets or the different brain systems, right? If they're on Mars in survival brain mode, they need some kind of distress tolerance skills. If they're physically safe and calm, but they're still emotionally agitated, they need some kind of emotion regulation. From there, once those first 2 systems have been settled, now their brain is ready for attachments, right? That's when we can zoom in on the therapeutic relationship and provide lots of acceptance and validation. So of course we should be doing that all along, but now their brain is ready for that. And then from there, once they feel safe in the therapeutic alliance, we can work on their thinking, right? And then from there, maybe we can help them deal with another person that's involved in the crisis, right? Some kind of interpersonal effectiveness. So if you think about it, those first 4 planets, we're helping them self-regulate, right? They cannot possibly deal with someone else if they haven't first regulated themselves. Okay, so what I would like to do in the rest of this webinar is go into a little more detail with each of these different treatment interventions. So what I'm simply going to do is I'm simply going to present just a few tools that we can use with clients that will help them move through the different planets. In other words, help them stabilize each of these different parts of the brain. So obviously, another point I want to make before I move on is no matter what planet the client is on, they need mindfulness. Mindfulness is the foundation. So I want to start off talking about what is mindfulness, and then we'll move into the other treatment interventions. Okay, so the best definition of mindfulness I've come across is this. Mindfulness is all about learning to pay attention for a specific purpose in the present without judging. So if you think about it, mindfulness is not just some random activity that we prescribe to people because we think it's a cool thing to do, right? Just sit in the corner and, pay attention to your breathing because it's what all the cool people do. No, it's for a very specific purpose. And especially in terms of treatment, we need to explain what that purpose is. If we don't explain what the purpose is, then they will not appreciate the value of what we're trying to convey. And mindfulness, as we all know, is specifically about learning to do a better job of focusing on the present moment. So obviously, we do not have to train clients to, worry more about the future or obsess more about the past, right? They already do that just fine. In fact, the default setting for all of us when we're not intentionally focusing on the present is to either start to think about the future or the past. That's why this is a skill set that needs to be developed. So does that mean the future and the past aren't important? Of course not. We're going to address that point in a little bit. But the bottom line is we cannot adequately prepare for the future if we're not first grounded in the present. Or we cannot adequately heal from the past if we're not first grounded in the present. So if you think about those first three themes, paying attention for a purpose in the present, that's basically what we've called concentration for centuries in our culture. But mindfulness is more than concentration. Mindfulness is more than one, two, and three. It's paying attention for a purpose in the present, but without judging what's going on in the present. So in other words, mindfulness just got a lot harder. Because basically what we're asking people to do when they're mindful is to be aware of everything in the present, but also in the process, quieting all of your commentary about what's going on in the present. Because as soon as we pay more attention to the commentary, we're no longer in the moment. So mindfulness is not just about awareness, right? 1, 2, and 3 is awareness. That's not mindfulness. Mindfulness is awareness plus acceptance. That's a hard skill to learn. So, why is being present in the moment such a big deal? Here's why, and this is kind of a point I already made. If we can help someone be present in the moment, well, now they actually can adequately prepare for something in the future. And if they have a plan for the future, well, now they're less worried and they can actually be more present in the moment, right? So there's this positive feedback loop. And it's the same thing with the past. So if we can help a client become grounded in the present, well, now they can actually be in a place to heal from the past. And if the more they heal from the past, the more they can be grounded in the present. Whereas if someone is only living in the future or the past, neither future nor past ever gets really adequately addressed. So once again, we can simplify, consolidate the entire theme of mindfulness really to this simple formula. Mindfulness is awareness and acceptance, both. Okay, so how do we, so far this has been kind of abstract. How do we actually teach this stuff to a client? A simple acronym to get us started is the STOP acronym. So if a client is in survival brain mode and they're doing something that is reactive and it's not very mindful, this is something they can do. They can stop, take a step back, or take a deep breath, observe what's going on, and then proceed mindfully. Well, how do you proceed mindfully? That's where this next acronym comes in. I love this acronym. This is a very simple formula for how to be more mindful. And you can pretty much apply this to anything. So in my case, I apply this to anger. So when I'm feeling frustrated, what I do is I recognize that frustration. Okay, so What does it feel like when I'm frustrated? Especially what does it feel like in my body, right? I learned to recognize it. And from there, I learned to allow it, right? Not fight it, not judge it, just welcome it, embrace it. And then from there, investigate it, right? So once again, instead of judging it or condemning it, I simply say, I wonder where that frustration is coming from. I wonder what triggered me. I wonder what's going on, right? And then from there, nurture, right? In other words, some kind of self-care, maybe go for a walk or maybe some deep breathing. So this rain dance will literally walk clients and yourself through the mindfulness process. And it's a really easy acronym to remember. Okay, so all of that was mindfulness. Let's switch gears now and talk about distress tolerance. So remember, distress tolerance is the skill set we need to use when the client is actively triggered, right, in their survival brain mode, right? They're on Mars. And this is another really simple acronym that can help when someone is physiologically aroused, right? So fight, flight, and freeze is actively triggered. And so what we can do is one of these 4 options. And so this isn't just an acronym, this is actually also a metaphor. Since there's such an obvious mind-body connection, if you can quickly tip your body chemistry, you can also tip what's going on with you psychologically in your mind. So that's the idea with these 4 different skills. The idea is to quickly change up your body chemistry as a way of also rapidly triggering change in your mind as well. So one way to quickly tip your body chemistry is to change up your temperature, right? So take a hot shower, take a cold shower, take a hot shower, cold shower, or drink something really hot or really cold, or something really hot, cold, hot, cold. So in other words, any way that you can quickly change up your body temperature will be a way to quickly trigger stabilization in the survival brain. So obviously, another good way of doing that is through any intense physical activity. So obviously, exercise in general has tons of both physiological and psychological benefits. We don't need to talk about that. But the idea here is any intense physical activity in the moment will also be a good way of stabilizing that survival brain. And the P part of the tip, there's 2 things, but there's only one P, and that's because they actually go together. So I'm sure we've all heard of controlled breathing. I'm sure we've all heard of progressive muscle relaxation. Well, that's what these 2 are about. But what's unique about the tip skill is you can actually do both at the same time for even more effect, right? So that's why we're calling it paced breathing with paired muscle relaxation. So the idea here is as you inhale, you tense your muscles. And then as you exhale, you relax your muscles. So you don't need to do necessarily all 4 of these in order to tip your body chemistry, but the more of these you can do, the better. So in my case, something I personally do to leave a tip, so to speak, is I go on these intense bike rides under the Texas sun, through hill country. So if you think about it, when I'm doing that, am I changing up my temperature? Yes. Is it tense exercise? Yes. Am I doing paced breathing with paired muscle relaxation? Yes. Because just riding my bike forces me to fall into a breathing rhythm. Not only that, every single time I pedal, I'm tensing, relaxing my muscles, right? So it's no wonder that for me personally, this is a really good way for me to tip my body chemistry. And it works amazingly. As soon as I'm done with my bike ride, I'm in a completely different frame of mind. Another way to help clients stabilize that survival brain is through what sometimes are called these self-soothing skills. So the idea here is to focus on one of the 5 senses and basically just mindfully engage in just that one sense. So in other words, find something to look at that will have a calming effect on you, or something that you can listen to, or some kind of aroma that you can relish, or some kind of flavor or ingredient that you can relish, or some kind of tactile sensation that you can relish. So these skills help us become quickly regrounded once again, which helps to stabilize that survival brain. So it can even be helpful to help a client come up with what's sometimes called a 5 senses pouch. In other words, have all 5 senses represented on their person or within close reach, so that at a moment's notice, they can access one of these 5 senses to restabilize. Another really good technique for stabilizing the survival brain is basically anything that will make you laugh. I recently listened to a TED Talk on the benefits of laughter, and I loved the presentation so much that I asked for this particular slide, because the whole point of this presentation was that laughter activates every single positive neurotransmitter we have in the brain at once. So serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin, and endorphins. That's pretty amazing. That's way better than any psychotropic medication I know of. And there's many other coping skills for the survival brain that I have listed in these 2 charts. I wasn't planning on going on explaining any of these in depth, but I'd be happy to follow up later if you have questions on any one of those skills. So very quickly, I want to talk about what to do when the client is beyond the survival brain, right? They're not on Mars anymore. Now they're on Jupiter. Now they're dealing with their emotion brain. So they might not have, they might not currently be triggered by fight, flight, freeze, right? They're physiologically stable, but their emotions are still a whirlwind. Now what? There's many skills out there. This is one of my favorite. I call this acting opposite. So this is how it works. We help clients identify their emotions that are the most triggering for them. In other words, emotions that get them in the most trouble. From there, we help them figure out, okay, so what's the urge that's associated with that emotion? Because a lot of times when we act on that urge, we actually make the original emotion worse or more intense. So it's really important to explain here at this point that the emotions themselves are never problematic. I'm not calling these problem emotions. No, we have certain emotions that are triggering for sure. But the problem is with the urge. So basically what happens is when we have certain emotions, and then we have certain urges associated with those emotions, the more we have the emotion, the more we have the urge, but the more we act on the urge, the worse the emotion becomes, right? And we just go round and round, and that's when we start to make decisions that are less than wise. So the only way out of this cycle is to act the opposite of your urge. So that's the idea of acting opposite. So obviously, nobody wants to do the opposite of what they want to do by definition. And that's why I call it acting opposite. So what I tell clients is, you don't have to like doing this. You don't have to feel like doing it. Just act opposite, right? Fake it till you make it, basically. So there's different ways that we can help clients act opposite. We can have them literally do the opposite what they feel like doing, or assume an opposite body posture, right? Instead of clenching up, maybe relax your arms. You can act opposite with body chemistry. So one example of that is what we already talked about with TIP, right? So if you literally start to feel your temperature rising because you're so angry, well, do something to literally physically cool you down. You can act opposite by visualizing the opposite through imagery. Or you can also act opposite with words. So in other words, say the opposite of what you feel like saying. What can also be helpful is to help clients create what I call this acting opposite chart or plan. So you help clients identify the trigger emotion. From there, help them figure out what's the urge associated with that emotion. And from there, help them figure out what would be the opposite of that. So for example, a very common trigger emotion might be depression. A very common urges associated with depression might be isolating or withdrawing or oversleeping or not taking such good care of yourself. So if you think about all of those urges, what do they do to the original depression? They make it worse. right? That's the cycle we were talking about earlier. The more you have the emotion, the more you have the urges. The more you act on the urges, the more you have the emotion, right? And you just go round and round. So that's why many disorders like anxiety and depression left untreated can be really, really hard for a client to get out of on their own. So that's why we help them come up with an acting opposite plan. So for depression, acting opposite might be, well, instead of isolating so much, find a way to socialize, right? Instead of neglecting your hygiene, engage in some basic self-care, etc. Okay, so at this point, we've helped the client stabilize that survival brain with the stress tolerance skills. We've helped them to stabilize the emotion brain with some emotion regulation. So now the client is ready to more fully access the attachment part of the brain. So that's where validation comes in. That's a really powerful tool that we can use with our clients, especially when the client is already in that attachment brain. I mean, sometimes we need to use lots of validation to get into the attachment brain, but especially when the attachment brain is open and receptive, that's when we want to leverage that opportunity to validate even more. So these are just some tips on how to validate well. So obviously, to validate someone, we need to be present and mindful. We can't validate if we're not paying attention to what's going on. But another powerful way to validate is when we can reflect back what the client is telling us. So either verbally or non-verbally. So reflecting back verbal communication, that's easy. We just use basic active listening skills. So we say things like, okay, so am I getting this right? Did I hear you correctly? Right, we're paraphrasing, we're summarizing what the other person has said, asking clarifying questions, etc. But we can also reflect back the nonverbal cues that our clients are giving us. So this is really the technique of mirroring. It's what we do with babies automatically, right? So if a baby starts cooing, what do? We coo back. If a baby smiles at us, what do? We smile back. If a baby says gobbledygook to us, what do? We say gobbledygook back, right? And nobody thinks that's weird because we do this instinctively and automatically with babies, right? They literally have mirror neurons in their brains that are communicating with mirror neurons in our brains. But we can also do this with our clients. This can be, it should be subtle, right? There's obviously a difference between mimicking versus mirroring. But if a client starts to accelerate their speech, maybe that's our cue to also talk a little bit more quickly too. Or if a client starts to talk more softly, maybe that's also a cue for us to also, reduce our volume. When we do this, the other person starts to feel validated at a subconscious level. They don't know what's going on. They just feel like the other person is really listening. Okay, so in addition to reflecting back what our clients are telling us, another level of validation is when we normalize what they're saying. So that's when we say things like, oh yeah, well, it makes sense that. Yeah, I can see why you would be so frustrated. So we can normalize, either something that happened in the past or something that's currently going on in the present. And then the highest level of validation, according to this framework, is what's sometimes called radical genuineness. So this is when we're just real with someone else. So this is slightly different than unconditional positive regard. Because if you think about it, if a client is in active crisis mode and we're just unconditionally positive, are they going to necessarily feel like we're connecting with them? Right? Maybe not. For example, I don't know if anyone can relate to this. If you are not a morning person like me, and it's 6 a.m. and someone else is just like all bubbly and chipper and just going on and on and on about how wonderful life is all of that positive energy rubbing off on you? I know in my case, it's not, right? So radical genuineness is when we're real with a person, not necessarily unconditionally positive. So obviously it takes lots of rapport for us to be, get to the point, lots of rapport and validation to get to the point where we can be radically genuine. But once we're there, we're going to have even more rapport and trust because the client will see us as real. Okay, so at this point, we've walked the client through the survival brain, right, with the stress tolerance skills. We've walked them through the emotion brain with emotion regulation skills. We've walked them through the attachment brain with validation skills. Now that those first three systems of the brain have settled down, now the client can access the front part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. In other words, what I've been calling the cognitive brain. But remember, just because they're in the cognitive brain now doesn't mean they're thinking completely clearly, right? They probably have all kinds of thinking errors that they've learned along the way. So now what do we do? Well, I'm going to throw out two different techniques we can use with clients. One technique, this is sometimes called cognitive diffusion. We can also think of this as simply mindfulness of thoughts. We simply help the clients recognize what these thoughts are that are going through their mind. And then we can help them externalize those thoughts by getting them out of their head, right? So they can say these thoughts out loud. They can write them down on paper. You can sing your thoughts. You can impersonate your thoughts, right? Using different voices or different characters. You can say your thoughts really fast, really slow, really loud, really soft. You can even start to provide a radio commentary on your thoughts. You can even exaggerate your thoughts even more than they already are. Make a comic strip of your thoughts. You can even tell yourself, thank you, brain, for sharing this information with me. In other words, these are all techniques for you to realize that whatever thoughts are going through your head are simply words. That's it. They're words going through your head. And yes, words are powerful, but words aren't necessarily always true. Right? So this is a way to get these words, identify these words, and get them out of your head and just realize them for what they are, words that are passing through my head. So for a lot of our clients, this can be very effective, just getting the words out of their head. For some clients, we'll then have to work on actually modifying these thoughts, right? Some kind of cognitive restructuring. And that's where this TOM acronym comes in. So once again, this is an acronym I created. And what this does is it helps a client become more balanced in their thinking. And this is how it works. You first help the client to simply identify whatever thought it is that's going through their head. And if it's a thought that's distressing, it's probably a pretty extreme thought, such as maybe I am worthless. So what you do then is you simply help them come up with the complete opposite extreme of that thought. So the complete opposite extreme might be something like, I am the most valuable human being that has ever lived, right? Everyone should bow down to me and say, you are the most worthy person that has ever, walked the face of this planet, right? And you just go on and on with embellishing, exaggerating the opposite extreme. And the reason it can be helpful to embellish that opposite extreme is because your client will realize what you're doing. They'll realize that's ridiculous. And you're just exaggerating that. And then you can say, oh, you're right, I am. So I wonder if you've done that to your original thought, right? You've taken some grain of truth, but you've embellished it. The thing is, we don't realize it when our own thoughts become extreme. But we do realize it when we take the opposite and see how extreme that can be. But anyway, once we've identified the two extremes, what we do now is we simply ask the client, okay, so what's something more in the middle? And if we help the client identify a middle thought, their thinking has just become a lot more balanced. So just because you've identified the middle thought, does that mean they automatically fully believe it yet? Well, of course not. But at least there's competition with the original thought. Now there's two options, right? And over time, you can help them reinforce that middle thought. Okay, so once everything else is stable, we can finally help clients deal with other people. And this will be the last point I want to make. So if a client is in crisis, it probably involves some version or variation of the drama cycle, right? There's probably some victim, some rescuer, and some persecutor. And as we all know from this, this cycle, it just goes on and on and on. As long as these three roles are being played out, conflict drama never gets resolved. So how do we help a client get out of that? Well, it's as simple as instead of being a victim, be a creator, right? A victim thinks they have no options. They're just stuck. Well, a creator realizes, actually, I do have options. And if they really don't have options, well, let's create some, right? If you think about it, a rescuer just enables. That causes all kinds of untold dysfunction. Well, instead of being a rescuer, let's be a coach. You can still help someone without enabling them. So like, for example, my kids play soccer. I've never seen one of their coaches jump on the field and start playing for them. No, the coach will provide all kinds of guidance from the sidelines, but the coach isn't playing the game. And finally, if our client is too much of the persecutor, how can we get them out of that mode? Well, instead of being the persecutor, help them be the challenger. Maybe someone really is doing something wrong, right? That doesn't mean we have to persecute that person and then perpetuate the same ongoing unresolved conflict, right? There are healthier, more effective ways of challenging a situation as opposed to keeping this drama cycle going on and on. Okay. So I realize that only leaves a few minutes left. Okay, I've seen lots of questions come in. I hope I've addressed most of these. If not, once again, I would be more than happy to follow up with each of you in person and answer these questions.
That was a lot of great information. And I know for me, the validation slide really hit home. I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and I see myself using a lot of those techniques to get down to their level, because sometimes I get really frustrated with working full-time, going to school full-time, and also being a mom, that sometimes I don't know what's going on. I don't know why you're having this reaction right now. But that validation slide really hit home with me, and that's going to help me be a better mom now. So thank you for that.
Good, I'm glad.
Let's see here. We have one question that came in. I don't know if you saw this. How can you differentiate between an attachment issue and ODD, sociopathy, and psychopathy that is structural brain problem, as I understand it?
Yeah, so there's no way I can fully address that. The framework I presented in this webinar was deliberately non-diagnostic. So I simply wanted to show how chronic trauma affects the brain in general. All specific, or I shouldn't say all, but many specific diagnoses that can flow from a traumatized brain will take on different forms, obviously. But I think more important than differentiating between every diagnosis is understanding what are the general themes and patterns that drive all of this dysfunction in the first place. So with regards to differentiation, I'd be more happy to address that more in detail later.
So Ded, if you want to go ahead and reach out to Dr. Reutter later, he can go over that question with you in more detail. Let me see if there's a general question here. Getting lots of positive comments in the chat. Everybody's enjoying your presentation. Maybe you can answer this question. What are some ways to separate trauma and disorder symptoms as they present similarly?
Okay, can you say that again?
Yes. What are some ways to separate trauma and disorder symptoms as they can present similarly?
So trauma and disorder symptoms?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so once again, what I explained in this presentation is how chronic trauma that affects brain development when it happens over and over and over again. So yes, that is different than someone that has completely normal, healthy, stable childhood, is now an adult, functioning very well, and something traumatic happens, and now they have some PTSD. You're absolutely right. How that plays out, there's overlap, but there's also a lot of difference. The main difference is someone that has a previous baseline of healthy brain functioning will be much more resilient and much more able to just bounce back. In fact, in those cases, a lot of times the PTSD will just naturally remit without any intervention. Someone that has experienced what's called complex trauma, in other words, this developmental trauma, does not just bounce back. They usually require lots of chronic intervention.
Great, thank you for that. We are a little bit over time, so we will have to end for today. If you have any questions, please send them over to me directly at ctl@ncu.edu, or you can reach out to Dr. Reutter with the contact information that he provided earlier in the slides. I will have this recording posted in the comments within 2 business days, along with the PowerPoint presentation. And thank you so much, everybody, for your time today. Thank you, Dr. Reutter, for being here. And I hope everybody enjoys the rest of your day and that I see you at our next webinar. Bye-bye, everybody.